Hello and welcome to the Week 11 Top 150 Rankings Show. Today, we're going to cover all the biggest changes that we've made to our rest of season rankings. Be sure to stay tuned to the end as we'll give our favorite moves to make this week. I think we need to start with a bad situation for anyone who has Cleveland Browns players here, Mark, because it was announced this morning, we're recording this Wednesday, around 3 p.m. Eastern, Deshaun Watson is going to miss the rest of the year due to some kind of shoulder surgery. Does not sound like rotator cuff surgery, which is normally what you have with these quarterback throwing shoulder things. It sounds like, I don't know, something else happened. But more weird vibes around Deshaun Watson. We're not going to talk about that here today. We are going to talk about how this affects Brown stuff going forward. Jerome Ford, Amari Cooper, David Njoku. I didn't think Deshaun Watson was playing very well, but they all have to be downgrades with Dorian Thompson, Robinson, Mark. So I don't even know what we could do at this point. You can't even really sell him. Who's going to be buying Amari Cooper at this point? But how would you be thinking about it if you have Browns guys right now?
It's pretty interesting, I think, because certainly, even though Deshaun Watson hasn't been playing great this season, had a good second half against the Ravens, but overall not playing very well. The drop off to Dorian Thompson Robinson is a big one. And if they go back to PJ Walker, big drop offs there we've seen in the betting markets this week. The Browns game has moved anywhere between 4 to 6 points in favor of the Steelers. So certainly a big drop off there. I think this hurts the Browns' ceiling in fantasy more so than their floor. And I think it especially hurts the pass catchers more than the running backs. I think, when we look at how the Browns are likely to play out their game scripts, is they're going to want to lean into their strong defense, one of the best defenses in the league, and then lean into their running backs who have both played well this year in Jerome Ford and Kareem Hunt and their strong offensive line. They have lost some tackle depth on their offensive line, but their interior is still good. Brandon Thorne still had them as a top 5 offensive line for us at the midseason mark. So I do think the Browns, will continue to pound the ball and give Ford and Hunt a lot of touches, but it certainly hurts the pass catchers. I think Amari Cooper, probably downgrades to a wide receiver 3 flex range, just given I think he'll probably still be the primary read when they do pass the ball. And then I do think it hurts David Njoku and Elijah Moore a lot, where, you probably don't feel comfortable starting them week in and week out. So overall, definitely a bigger hit to the pass catchers, but we've seen this Browns offense, provide a really good floor all season. They've run at least 65 plays per game in every single game this season, which is they're the only team in the NFL to do that. So we've seen the play volume be solid just with how strong their defense has been and how they've been able to sustain drives, even with backup quarterbacks. So I think we can feel decent about the floor, but the ceiling certainly in question. And yeah, I don't think people are going to be buying. So it's kind of a hold situation. And hopefully, you get some touchdown luck go your way.
Yeah, I was a little surprised that they went to DTR over PJ Walker, and maybe that's my XFL bias, but I will say that DTR probably gives them a better ceiling. He gives you a more of a rushing component than PJ Walker. And then also DTR, I know he really struggled in his first regular season start. He was very good in the NFL preseason for what it's worth. PFF actually had DTR as their number 12 quarterback in the preseason out of 70 qualifiers. So I'm not completely writing off Amari Cooper and Njoku with DTR, but obviously it's a hit. I don't think we should be like panic selling these guys whatsoever. I want to talk about the bye weeks here, Jack, before we get too much further into it. This week, there's 4 teams on a bye. Next week is Thanksgiving, my least favorite week of the year, and there are no teams on a bye on Thanksgiving. But I want to be clear here. Week 13 and week 14 are typically huge fantasy weeks. Some leagues even start their playoffs that early, but there's certainly huge games. Week 13, these teams are on a bye. Buffalo, Chicago, Las Vegas, Minnesota, New York Giants, Baltimore. Week 14, Arizona and the Fighting Trey Gronkowskis and Washington Commanders are both on a bye. And so I think one thing you can do in the trade market very clearly is tell people who are scrapping for a playoff spot, listen, if you have Josh Allen or Steph Diggs or TJ Hawkinson or whatever, you're not going to have them in week 13. And that is a massive game for you. You should be giving me these guys at a discount. I'll give you someone who has already had their bye. So I think that's like something really simple that people can do around bye weeks in the trade market here before their trade deadline. Jack, any other thoughts on trade deadline and bye week stuff?
Yeah, I think you pretty much nailed it. But there are just a lot of really important players that have a bye, and especially in week 13, you've got Mark Andrews, Zay Flowers, you mentioned Diggs and Allen, you've got Justin Jefferson, Devontae Adams, Josh Jacobs. Like, these are players that a lot of fantasy teams are depending on for consistent weekly production. And if you're 5-5 right now and you can't really afford a loss, then it's definitely a consideration to trade them for someone that is going to be out there all 3 or 4 weeks or however long your league has until the playoffs start. I think this idea also applies to injured players a little bit, like a Kyron Williams or a Josh Downs or I guess Downs is on bye this week and he was limited last week, so he could fit more in the bye category. But guys like that who are not going to be at 100% or aren't going to play at all, if you can get them at a discount and they could contribute to your fantasy team in the playoffs, that's another consideration. But it all just boils down to trading short-term production for teams that need wins now versus optimizing for weeks 15 through 17 for teams that are 8-2 or 9-1 and have a spot pretty much locked up.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's something easy to lose track of, but is certainly an important thing if you're grinding hard, similar to if you have a 9-1 team, to start thinking about playoff stashes. I know that me and Sam talked a little bit about that on the waiver wire show. You can go back and listen to that if you're looking for some more playoff stashes in the defensive range. I had some team situations here, Mark, with the Ravens backfield. Everybody's clamoring for Keaton Mitchell to get more touches. I think we're going to start to see some better defined roles. I mean, Gus Edwards is clearly the quote unquote starter, but Gus Edwards also is the goal line back. I think we could start to see fewer between the 20s carries for Gus if they're going to give more to Keaton. I'd actually rather see him just completely eliminate Justice Hill at this point. But yeah, what do you think about handling Ravens backfield going forward? There's probably a lot of people that picked up Keaton Mitchell and now aren't really sure what to do. It's hard to play a guy who's only can get like 10 snaps in a game.
I agree with you that I think Gus Edwards' role is unlikely to change all that much. Just given his size and how the Ravens have operated around the goal line so far this year, I do think he'll retain the goal line role. And as you said, if he does cede carries to Keaton Mitchell, it's likely going to be in the 20s. And what we've seen from Keaton Mitchell is he can turn those into touchdowns with how explosive he's been. And I do think it's likely that Justice Hill kind of gets iced here a bit more. So, if I'm ranking these backs on who I'd rather have on my fantasy team, like I think Gus Edwards clearly is the safest week-to-week floor. And if he gets you a touchdown, like he's probably giving you double-digit points. So I think that's solid. And then Keaton Mitchell, just with the upside, like, if he can, if Justice Hill does go away almost entirely, I could kind of see him being, a lesser version of J.K. Dobbins, where if he gets 10 to 12 touches a week, he could be really efficient still, average over 5 yards a carry. And if he does bust a long touchdown, then you're in business there. So, so far, last week, Justice Hill was really kind of resigned just to a passing game role. So if Keaton Mitchell can take over being able to pass block and operate on pass downs, then I really think like the last 2 weeks of the season and then playoffs, the upside could be there. So at this point, I'd be willing to drop Justice Hill, and Keaton Mitchell, I think, is a great stash. And then Gus Edwards is kind of, the steady back that I think we can rely on the most for weekly fantasy output.
Yeah, I think that's really fair. Let's go to another backfield, Jack, that I think people finally saw what they wanted to see, at least out of Atlanta Falcons, Arthur Smith, Bijan Robinson last week. One of my moves to make last week was to buy Bijan in the hopes that Arthur Smith would capitulate some. He indeed capitulated pretty much all the way that I think he should. Like the way that they used Bijan Robinson, I know he didn't get enough targets, but I thought the way they used him in that game was like the way they should be, even if he could stand more work. But the other reason that I had Bijan as a guy to buy last week was the playoff schedule. Panthers, Colts, Bears, final 3 games in the fantasy season for the Falcons. I mean, it's not going to get much easier than that. Do you think this is sticky, Jack, especially the goal line stuff? Because that's really the one that concerns me, that like at any time Arthur could be like, you know what? I know Bijan scored from the 5-yard line, but Algiers our guy there, or something like that. So yeah, any thoughts on Falcons backfield now that we've seen Mr. Smith capitulate a little bit?
Yeah, I think it was a really good sign to see Arthur Smith not just immediately insert Algier at the goal line. I don't think Bijan is going to be like the designated goal line back moving forward with what Smith has said about Algier in the goal line. Algier was in on a red zone drive that Desmond Ridder ended up taking on a run, but Algier had only a second carry, or Robinson had only a second carry from inside the 5 this season. He doubled the amount of carries he had from inside the 10. He went from 2 to 4. So I think it was a pretty good sign. And if Bijan can get even 50% of the goal line work, I think that vaults him up the ranks in a pretty significant way.
Yeah, agreed. Let's stick with, you know what? Let's stick with the Steelers backfield, Jack. I was a bit surprised that Mike Tomlin came out. Like, you don't have to say this stuff, but I guess he was asked about it, and he strikes me as an honest guy. And he says, yeah, I thought Jaylen Warren deserved to be announced as the starter. So, when if you've been to an NFL game, which I haven't been to in forever, but they announce the quote unquote starters, right? Does it really matter, though, who the starter is? The usage between Najee and Jaylen Warren has been pretty stagnant all year. I feel like the market is going to overreact to this statement, Jack, but should we be overreacting this statement, I guess, that Jaylen Warren is now known as the starter for the Steelers?
Yeah, I don't think it's that significant that Warren was announced as the starter, but it feels a little significant that Mike Tomlin went out of his way to highlight that he was announced as the starter and said that he had earned it. Plus, Warren went over 100 yards, and it was also the closest gap we'd seen all season in terms of carries. Najee had 16 carries, Warren had 15, so that's a lot closer than it's been most of the season when it's been just under a 2-to-1 ratio. And Warren has been the pass catching back the whole season. He has a strong role as a receiver, and if he can get close to 50% of the carries, I think that's a pretty valuable role. The one thing is that Najee is going to be the goal line back, but I think if Warren continues to be the primary pass catching back, and there's really no reason to expect he won't be, and he's getting 50% of the early down carries outside of goal line, I think that's a pretty valuable role. And the fact that Tomlin highlighted him as someone who deserved to be announced as a starter, and then he went out and with an expanded workload had over 100 rushing yards, I think it's somewhat significant.
I definitely think it's notable. We do have Warren ahead of Najee in the rankings, but only by one spot here, which I think is right. It's really hard to know on a week-to-week basis what's going to happen, but obviously I think Warren is a better player, and Pittsburgh seems to start to be agreeing. Speaking of backfields, Mark, I think a tricky spot is Devin Singletary versus Dameon Pierce. Even before Dameon Pierce's injury, we saw him start to cede a bunch of work. He was no longer had anything close to the workhorse role. Then you get a bad Devin Singletary game when Pierce was out, but then you get a really good one here last week against the Bengals. When Dameon Pierce comes back, how do you think this backfield plays out? And by the way, in the rankings now, we do have Devin Singletary ahead of Dameon Pierce by about 16 spots.
Yeah, I put Singletary ahead because, as you mentioned, kind of going into their bye week, it seemed like the coaching staff was leaning more into Singletary just with the design of this rushing offense. There were comments about him being able to hit the holes better. His vision was better with this offensive scheme, and Dameon Pierce was struggling to pick that up. And then this past week, Devin Singletary got 30 carries, and not another Texan running back got a carry. I mean, that's pretty absurd to see in the modern NFL for a running back to get 30 carries and the other running backs didn't get a single one. So that really, alerted me to, okay, they trust Devin Singletary. They believe in him. Obviously he was cooking. I mean, he had 150 yards in that game, so he was playing well. But yeah, I mean, I think just based on the coaching staff comments and how Singletary has performed without Pierce in the lineup, I expect him to get the bulk of the carries even when Pierce returns. To be determined whether he gets the goal line role along with that. And I still do believe in Dameon Pierce's talent. Like, if he can figure out the offensive scheme, I think, he's not like completely droppable right now, but man, what Singletary showed this past weekend, I think you have to put him ahead of Pierce for the rest of the season.
Yeah, agreed. And we don't even know how severe this Pierce injury is either. So we'll see on that. We have 6 Houston Texans in the top 120 now. I mean, God, I can't believe I'm going to lose this offensive rookie of the year market. I thought I got it in so good on Bijan, and now Stroud is like minus 2,000 to win it. It's so ridiculous. Anyways, keep moving here to the Jacksonville stuff, Jack. There's a lot of full-blown panic out there. There's people that are like, oh my gosh, what have I done? Calvin Ridley stinks. Trevor Lawrence is dust. Jaguars stink. I didn't think it was that big a deal to get your doors blown off by the 49ers, I mean, I get it was really ugly, but that's one that I would not completely overreact to. There's so much talent on the defensive side of the ball, and teams sometimes lay an egg. Now, I do think the Calvin Ridley stuff is concerning at this point. He's just not getting open, and where he runs routes is not as valuable as where Christian Kirk does. So I get there's some concern there, but what's your overall level of concern on Jacksonville right now and on these guys going forward?
Yeah, on the Jags, I'm not too concerned. I mean, it's one game against a really good defense. We have a larger sample of the Jags being an above average offense. On the individual pass catchers, I agree with you that Ridley is the most concerning. His target share has just been so volatile. And over the past 6 games, he has 2 games over 26% and 3 games with 13% or less, which is just a really absurd range in terms of volume. Whereas guys like Christian Kirk and especially Evan Ingram have been really consistent with Zay Jones out. So Ridley, I don't think that he's suddenly going to be like dust. I don't think the performance he had on Sunday is indicative of what you should expect going forward. But I do think that his range of outcomes and consistency is as wide as almost anyone in the league. And Kirk and Ingram are safer bets for weekly volume.
Yeah. I think also we should probably drop Tank Bigsby out of the top 150. This guy has been like the worst running back in the entire NFL this season and may have lost his job to Dearness Johnson. He's the one that, gosh, down bad. Okay. Let's move to the questions. And I do want to save time for our very prestigious moves to make. Let's go ahead and get to the questions from this week. Appreciate everyone who sent them in on Twitter. Watson says, how are we feeling about Kyren Williams once back from injury? Looked like a smash before, but I'm worried Hendo/Royce may get mixed in now. So Kyren is expected back for week 12. This week, it will be another Darrell Henderson, likely the feature back. I'm sorry. Yes, Darrell Henderson, likely the feature back, and Royce Freeman behind him. What we know about Kyren Williams is they love this dude. Like, love so much, even when it seems no one else does or should. So, Mark, what do you think about the Rams backfield split once we get Kyren back in week 12?
Yeah, we hit on this a little bit last week too, and I think it's fair to expect that just given the time off and with Kyren's injury, based on his prior workload, that they're likely to give him a little bit less of a workload than he was seeing earlier in the season. Again, it was just, unheralded stuff that we see at the running back position with him getting 100% of the snaps and nearly 100% of the touches early on. So I do expect Darrell Henderson most likely to eat in a bit more. I do think like the vast majority of the snaps will go to Kyren. I think he's, we could still expect 75 to 80% of the snaps and hopefully the goal line role there. So I do think he'll come right back in and be an RB2. They do have a couple tough matchups when he returns. They play Cleveland and Baltimore in back-to-back weeks, but then the fantasy playoff schedule really lightens for them, where they have Washington, New Orleans at home, and then at the Giants. So in general, I lean towards, buying Kyren if you're worried or people are worried that he's not going to get a full workload when he returns. I still think he will be the RB1 there.
A couple questions on David Montgomery, Jack. From John says, is David Montgomery a sell high? And then Gary says, Javonte Williams or David Montgomery rest of season. So the underlying usage looked okay, but not great for David Montgomery. Part of that was because he broke off, a whatever 50-yard touchdown run or whatever it was, which sucked a lot of the snaps and routes from away from him, which he would have had if they had that whole drive. So I'm still kind of in on David Montgomery, but I understand that people can see the writing on the wall. This isn't going to get much better than 50-50 at this point for David Montgomery versus Jahmyr Gibbs. So yeah, any thoughts on selling David Montgomery right now or holding him, Jack?
Yeah, I don't mind selling him if anyone is willing to buy into the fantasy points he scored based on the 75-yard touchdown. The most concerning thing was the Jahmyr Gibbs getting two carries from the 1-yard line. He converted both of them. David Montgomery had a couple carries inside the 5. He didn't score on either of those. That probably doesn't matter and probably won't affect their usage in the red zone moving forward, but there's at least a non-zero chance that Lions coaches see Jahmyr Gibbs pounding in touchdowns from a yard out and think maybe he can do this, and we don't immediately have to go back to David Montgomery as the goal line back moving forward. So I don't mind it from that perspective. I mean, Gibbs has just also been really good. And if Montgomery doesn't have like a surefire grip on the goal line roll, then a lot of his value evaporates. So I don't totally mind him as a sell high.
Yeah, I thought that it was a drive-by-drive situation. And to your point, it was encouraging that it was Jahmyr Gibbs' drive, and they didn't take him out because David Montgomery's better at the goal line. They were like, you know what? It's Jahmyr Gibbs' drive, and they let him finish with 2 short touchdowns. And I kind of think that's the way they're going to play it, drive-by-drive, you know? So I still think Monty can be fine in a drive-by-drive situation. But to Jack's point, it's how is your trade partner valuing David Montgomery at this point? We have him 41st overall in our top 150, Jahmyr Gibbs 34th overall. JF Bella says Tua and Dobbs hold both and play matchups. So this is what spot that you get into in the onesie positions when you pick up someone who's very good. Evan and I talked about this some yesterday with the Trey McBride. If you picked up Trey McBride and you also have another good tight end, well, now what? It seems to me that you have a pretty good piece for a trade. Now, Tua and Dobbs is a different story because, at least partially, Tua has a very difficult fantasy playoff schedule. Very difficult, probably like the hardest in the league. Jets, Cowboys, Ravens. And so if you have Tua, having another quarterback you can play in those weeks, if you choose, might make some sense. Generally, though, Mark, I really don't like to carry 2 quarterbacks if I don't have to. What do you think about this one? If you have, there's probably a lot of people out there that picked up Josh Dobbs and feel like they can get by with him in addition to without their starter.
I think it's fine in this scenario to hold both. I would personally hold both just because, as you mentioned, the playoff schedule for Tua is really brutal. And then also they play the Jets in week 12, which and the Vikings get the Bears at home. Like, I would much rather play Dobbs at home against the Bears than Tua on the road against the Jets in that one. So I think holding both is valuable. The Dolphins schedule is really strong the other 3 weeks, excluding that Jets game out of the next 4. So I like Tua a lot at that point. And then the Minnesota playoff schedule is pretty solid as well. They are at the Bengals, at home against the Lions, and at home against the Packers. So I could definitely see, kind of ping-ponging your way the rest of the season with both of those quarterbacks. So in this situation, where both are low-end quarterback ones, I think, and I think it's fair to put Dobbs in that category now, just given the rushing floor he's produced. I would personally hold both and play the matchups.
Yeah. Dan says, what wide receivers would you target if trying to trade away Laporta or Trey McBride to a tight end needy team? So this is the other side of what I was just talking about. A lot of people picked up Trey McBride. They have someone like Laporta. They have someone like Mark Andrews. They have someone like George Kittle. But now they're like, I want to start Trey McBride every week. And why wouldn't you want to start Trey Gronkowski every week? Who can you get? So depends. These questions are so hard to answer. But like where we have Trey McBride at 70 overall, we have guys in that range like Deontay Johnson, Jordan Addison, Drake London, Chris Godwin, Tank Dell. I mean, if you need help at the wide receiver position, I think that is a kind of trade that I would certainly be willing to make. Jack, any thoughts on trading away Laporta and McBride for a wide receiver?
Yeah, I think those are good names. I think in a lot of leagues, honestly, depending on how hard or how bad your trade partner is hurting a tight end and how good Trey McBride has been lately, you could maybe even aim a little higher with that and like get a Zay Flowers or a Hopkins or Lockett or someone like that, because a lot of teams are just insanely desperate for tight end, and McBride is obviously coming off a career game. But yeah, in general, I agree with pretty much everything you said.
Yeah, I mean, you could even aim higher, man. Like if somebody is smoking the sauce and they want to give you, DK Metcalf or Nico Collins for Trey McBride, and you can keep starting Laporta. That strikes me as exciting. Sports Asshole, nice name. Sports Asshole says Kupp and Nakua. I picked up Nakua assuming he was just a 4-week replacement, but now I have no idea what he is. Do you? So we've talked a lot about Puka Nakua this season. Even when Cooper Kupp's been back, Puka Nakua has continued to earn targets at a really high rate. I am optimistic on this entire Rams offense if Matthew Stafford is healthy, Cooper Kupp is healthy, and they can stay in the playoff race. That's asking a lot, right? That's like a parlay of all 3 of those things is hard. But yeah, we still have Nakua up at 30th overall. I feel pretty good about that, Mark, as long as we feel good about Stafford's health. Any more thoughts on Nakua?
This situation, the Rams in general, I think is like one of the biggest risk reward plays of kind of the remaining fantasy season, because They are whatever 3-6 right now, and Stafford has been unhealthy at a lot of points in his career, and the Rams do have their first round pick for the first time in a long time next season, so we could potentially see them fold it up a little bit if things go poorly the next few weeks. But overall on Puka, and specifically, I mean, as you said, like his role really hasn't diminished all that much with Cooper Kupp back. It's just really been concentrated around those two. So I think Puka is pretty much a locked in wide receiver 2 the rest of the way. And I hit on, their friendly playoff schedule earlier when talking about Kyron. So Puka is definitely more of a hold for me. And I feel confident starting him as a wide receiver 2 the rest of the season, as long as Stafford's in there. And then I think since they signed Carson Wentz, that adds a little bit of insurance as well in case Stafford goes down.
Barron has 2 questions. He says, what do you do with Tony Pollard? Sell low or hold? And then also, is Alvin Kamara rocket ship emojis off of the Michael Thomas news? It's enough with the emojis. Anyways, excuse me. I'll answer the Tony Pollard one first, then I'll send it to Jack. If you've had Tony Pollard this whole time, I don't think you can sell him off of the game he had last week before he plays the Panthers. You're not going to get much for him right now unless people are really excited about this Panthers matchup. I would probably hold him, hope he scores against the Panthers. And just to reiterate, he had a touchdown call back by a ridiculous call 2 weeks ago. He got stopped at the 6-inch line twice this past week. So I'd be holding until after this Panthers matchup. Alvin Kamara, rocket ship emoji on that Michael Thomas news. I'm not sure that affects it that much. I think the biggest thing for Alvin Kamara would be if Jameis Winston starts. That is trouble for him, but they seem to be likely saying they're going back after the bye to Derek Carr, which I think would be good, obviously, for Alvin Kamara, combined with Michael Thomas being out. So, yeah, I could see rocket ships for Kamara, but only if it's Carr. Jack, any thoughts on Kamara stuff going forward?
Yeah, I'm with you there, especially on the Carr and Winston thing. I still don't think, even if it is Carr, that Alvin Kamara is all of a sudden like this insane asset without Michael Thomas, just because Taysom and Jamal Williams are such big factors, especially at the goal line. But it's definitely good news for his receiving outlook.
Yeah, and to me, that's the biggest part. I mean, I'm worried about Alvin Kamara's snap share and Jamal Williams and Taysom and Kendra Miller's going to come back at some point. There's concern there. But what you need is the pass catching. And so the Derek Carr thing is so important there for Kamara. All right. Nobody listened to all that. They're fast forwarded. They're just tuning in now for the moves to make ahead of week 11. My moves last week were buy Bijan, sell Raheem Mostert. If you didn't get the Mostert deal done last week, I'd still probably be trying to do it here. But yes, Mark, I give you the floor if you're ready to go with your first move to make.
Yeah, I'll add in a quick one here too before I get to my real one, and that's add the Miami Dolphins defense. They have a great stretch here of Vegas, the Jets, Washington, Tennessee, and the Jets again. So I think defense is often overlooked as a difference maker, but I think Miami the next 5 weeks can really be a strong asset to have as we make the playoff push. But my real kind of like move to make out there is for winning teams to buy Cooper Kupp or Puka Nacua. And have kind of hit on this a couple times, but I really think this is a great risk reward bet if you're trying to win the championship. And it looks like you're going to waltz into the playoffs because I do think like the Rams. We heard Justin Jefferson talk about like when he was questioned if he's going to come back this season. He was like, I'm trying to get into the Hall of Fame. I have Hall of Fame aspirations. I want to be a great player in this league. I'm not just going to sit out games to sit out. And I think Matthew Stafford and Cooper Kupp, like they have that same mentality. These guys want to be great NFL players, and I don't think they're going to sit out just because the team is losing. I think it would take a legit injury to get them out. So I think investing in them down the stretch, people are a little scared because the results haven't been there for the Rams heading into their bye. I think coming out of their bye, we can feel a little bit better about Stafford's health. I like this passing offense and investing in them. So I think now is a good time to buy both Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua for the stretch run. I think they could be potential league winners. And yeah, I think the Carson Wentz signing also adds some insurance there that if Stafford does go down, they aren't going to Brett Rippon. Who knows how good Wentz will be, but it's got to be better than Brett Rippon.
I believe I misspoke on this show maybe last week or 2 weeks ago. I called Brett Rippon Mark Rippon's son. The police got all over me. It's actually Mark Rippon's nephew. So issuing a correction there to the Rippin family. Jack, your first move to make. I like that one from Mark, by the way. I mean, if you're reaching for first place, Cooper Kupp, every time he steps on the field, has wide receiver 1 overall ability. There's no doubt about that. Jack, go ahead with your first move to make.
Yeah, I'm going to do add Rashad Bateman. It's got to be pretty cheap because Bateman has been overall a disappointment this season. But he finished second among Ravens wide receivers in routes last week with 23. That was a route on 76.7% of the Ravens dropbacks. That was easily his best share of the season. Odell Beckham scored a 40-yard touchdown on his only target of the game, but he was actually 4th in targets behind both Bateman and Nelson Aguilar, who's been the slot receiver. And then the Ravens passing offense in terms of touchdowns has really just run pretty bad over the past few weeks. They have 99 points in the past 3 games, and Lamar Jackson has 2 passing touchdowns. So I think that you can expect the Ravens passing offense to start producing more touchdowns based on how prolific they have been at moving the ball. And with Bateman as the wide receiver 2 there, I mean, Zay Flowers and Mark Andrews are going to take a lot of targets, but I think there is room for a third option to get somewhere in the 15 to 20% of target range, and that could be a pretty viable asset in this passing offense. So I think it's mostly just a play on how cheap he must be because he didn't produce even though he had the routes last week. But yeah, so I like adding Rashad Bateman here with the increased playing time.
All right. Add Rashad Bateman. I like it. We'll see how Bateman fares on Thursday against the Bengals in a very big AFC North game. I'm going to stick with the Ravens. But with a bit of a different lean on it. I'm going to go buy Lamar Jackson. You guys are crazy. You guys have no idea what goes on in my mentions and my DMs. There are people who want to drop Lamar Jackson. There are people who want to bench Lamar Jackson for like really thin quarterback plays. And I understand Lamar Jackson last 3 weeks has accounted for 2 touchdowns and has not topped 223 passing yards in any of them, like 3 straight floor games, basically, for Lamar Jackson, even though the Ravens have scored 31, 37, and 31 points in that frame. Now, Lamar Jackson, to me, is not as elite as Jalen Hurts or Josh Allen because of the rushing touchdown stuff. And I get that Lamar is still going to score rushing touchdowns. He will not score them as consistently as Jalen Hurts, of course, because of all the tush-push stuff. However, Lamar Jackson is going to score rushing touchdowns. He's going to have huge games. Just 4 games ago, that Lions game, he went absolutely off, 357 pass yards, 3 touchdowns, also ran one in. There's going to be way more games like that coming for Lamar Jackson. And perhaps most importantly, and also to Jack's point on Bateman, in the fantasy playoffs, week 15, they get Jacksonville, potential shootout, Ravens-Jaguars. San Francisco, which is not a good matchup, but still a potential shootout. And then most importantly, week 17, Ravens-Dolphins. I understand Dolphins defense is getting better, but I think that Tua versus Lamar could be a really good back and forth game there in week 17 for the Ravens. And so if people are panicking on Lamar Jackson, Mark Andrews, I think it's a really interesting time to be buying on them. So my first move to make, buy Lamar Jackson. Mark, your second move to make.
I'm going to go with a sell here, and that's to sell the Washington Commanders receivers. You get a bit of a widespread one here. I think it's viable to sell both Terry McLaurin and Jahan Dotson. They have a great matchup against the Giants this weekend, so I think now is a decent time to do this because you can kind of pitch to whoever you're selling to that they have a good matchup against the Giants this weekend. Look how much they're throwing the ball, and they are for sure. But after this game, they have an extremely tough schedule coming up. They play at Dallas, Miami, and then they have a week 14 bye, which I think is tough. And then in the fantasy playoffs, decent matchup against the Rams the first week, but then at the Jets and the 49ers here. So just given how much, they've been spreading the ball around, I think it's tough to rely on guys like Terry McLaurin and Jahan Dotson to post, consistent weekly scores. So even if they have a decent ceiling, I'm a little concerned about their floor moving forward, just with the tough matchups and how they're spreading the ball around. So if you can, sell these guys as wide receiver 2s or 3s, I think now is a decent time to get out.
Yes. Chiefs East, as I like to call them, the passing game of the Commanders continues to get flattened out. Jack, your second and final move to make.
Yeah, we touched on this a bit earlier, but I'm going to go with sell Najee Harris. He scored at least 11 PPR fantasy points in 4 straight games. He scored a touchdown in his last 2 games and 3 of his last 4. So I think that he does have some fantasy value right now. But Jaylen Warren still has the primary pass catching role. Najee is not a complete zero there. He still has an okay target share. But Warren is getting the bulk of that work. And then we saw Mike Tomlin praise Jaylen Warren. We saw Jaylen Warren have his closest rush split relative to Harris of the season, and we saw Jaylen Warren play well with that rush split going over 100 yards. So I think Najee is basically, I think the rushing workload is going to go down. I think he's going to be pretty dependent on touchdowns moving forward, and he should have that goal line role still. I don't think Warren is going to eat into him as much there, but that kind of begs the question of, like, how much is the Steelers' goal line running back worth? And I don't think it's that much, especially relative to how many fantasy points Najee scored over the past month. So yeah, I'm gonna go with sell Najee Harris.
Yeah, and another thing that I'd add to that is he's seen at least 4 targets in 3 straight games. Has Najee Harris? That seems fluky to me. I mean, even when he was playing a ton, he was not getting that many targets. Now he's playing way less and he's getting more targets. And I don't think it's because he's like playing the third downs or anything like that. It's just been fluky, I think. And so yeah, I agree. Selling Najee at this time, especially ahead of this matchup against Cleveland, is an interesting one. All right. My final move to make is going to be one for a guy coming off of a bad game. You know, that's how I like to do it. Marquise Brown caught just 1 ball in Kyler Murray's return. And maybe people are out there saying, oh, you see, Marquise Brown doesn't have good chemistry with Kyler Murray, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, that is just absolute 1-game sample nonsense. Kyler Murray targeted Marquise Brown on 25% of his throws last year when they played together. And also Marquise Brown just consistently earns a really high target share on this team. Also came very close to a long touchdown in that game. Did Marquise Brown. It was just slightly overthrown. Arizona's fantasy playoff schedule, I think, is good for Marquise Brown. In week 16, they play the Eagles. And I think Eagles is probably like one of the best matchups for wide receivers right now because teams get behind so often and Eagles corners have been slow and struggling. So Eagles in week 16 and then Bears in week 17 for Marquise Brown. It's actually gotten a bit difficult to run the ball on the Bears. And so I think pass heavy game plans for opponents of the Bears make some sense. And that would obviously be good for Marquise Brown. So I will go with Fake Hollywood. Buy Fake Hollywood. Marquise Brown. I call him Fake Hollywood because he's from Hollywood, Florida, not Hollywood, California. All right. That is going to do it for this edition of the Rest of Season Top 150 show. We will have news on our content schedule for next week ahead of Thanksgiving. We'll be focused on the 3-game Thanksgiving slate. So I suspect we won't be doing this show next week, but we will have top 150 rankings certainly updated. But yeah, really excited about the Thanksgiving slate. Always one of the best slates of the year. The 3-gamer next Thursday. If you do not have your in-season package yet, we will be running a Black Friday sale. Stay tuned for that on Black Friday. Actually, we might launch it before that. Why wait till Black Friday? See what everybody in HR thinks. For Jack, for Mark, for producer Ryan, I am Adam. Good luck, everybody.